There's a certain type of phone call that arrives with no warning, the kind your gut tells you even before you answer that life's about to divide into before and after. For me, it came late Thursday afternoon, unfamiliar number flashing on the dashboard as I drove back from a supplier's meeting 100 miles from home. The voice on the other end trembled as it cut through the static. "You'd better get back here. They're tearing your house down. Not remodeling, not emergency repair. Tearing it down." I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't need to. My chest tightened as I broke every traffic law, except the ones that could get me thrown in jail, gripping the steering wheel so hard my palms hurt. When I finally pulled onto my street, the cloud of dust hit before the sight did, just past my neighbor's old oak, where my house had stood for 43 years. There was only a twisted skeleton of boards, earth, and concrete slabs, and right at the edge, clipboard in hand, stood Karen, the HOA president, smiling politely, as if she were supervising groundskeeping, not an execution. If you want to understand Karen and the HOA she led, you just have to watch her in moments like this. Pearl necklace, perfectly centered, blazer. Pressed, she stands in front of the news cameras, as if nothing about all this is extraordinary. "We at the Magnolia Pines HOA have strict community standards," she says, pausing to let the cameras catch her best angle. "Safety and harmony are our top priorities." Her voice is syrupy, but there's no warmth behind it. Only the pride of someone who's won before the first move is made. Behind her, neighbors gather in loose clusters, nobody making eye contact with me, most avoiding the rubble entirely. They whisper parts sympathy, parts self-preservation. Through it all, I walk the perimeter of what used to be my home. I don't say a word. I'm careful, almost methodical, studying the shattered bricks and splintered wood, picking up a handful of earth where my dad once planted tomatoes. My calm only unsettles Karen further. She glances over, expecting outrage or a scene. Instead, I give her nothing. Now maybe it's best I explain how it all started. Let's back up. You don't live somewhere for decades without the place leaving fingerprints all over you. My father's blueprint still sat folded in a drawer, a little yellowed, his neat handwriting on every margin. I'd run my hands along the same bricks he set when we poured the foundation together. The deed, signed in faded ink almost 50 years ago, wasn't just a document to me. It was a promise. What's built by hand is worth defending. Then the first letter appeared. On crisp HOA stationery, it accused me of violating visual harmony guidelines. Apparently, my new mailbox was 2 shades too dark. It felt ridiculous, but I swapped it out. Or thought I did. Days later, while I was out of state for work, came the second letter. Notice of default judgment. Hearing had come and gone scheduled when I was unreachable. Next, Karen's last coldly efficient, final notice. Fix it in 48 hours or the HOA would enforce compliance, her phrase as bureaucratic as it was menacing. Not a conversation, not a question, an ultimatum. Turns out that was only a preview. Standing ankle-deep in dust, I listened to the stories tumble out from nervous neighbors, none willing to say too much. Some had watched the demolition crew show up just after dawn, hard hats, county plates, clipboards for everyone. No hesitation, no second guessing. Karen, they said, was on site the whole time, arms crossed, barely blinking, repeating that it was a health and safety emergency. Apparently, the old house was such a menace it needed erasing by lunch. But what struck me wasn't the force, it was the precision. Not just the walls, but every trace of a home deliberately scraped from the land. Topsoil peeled back as if prepping for a new development. The foundation itself broken into neat, uniform chunks. All that remained were the city lot marker by the sidewalk, the sprawling limbs of our family's ancient oak, and in the very back the detached garage, one battered file cabinet they'd left untouched and locked by accident. Not an oversight, I'd soon realize, but the only thread they hadn't severed clean through. By noon the next day the dust had settled, but I hadn't. I spent hours capturing every remaining detail, hundreds of photos, aerial shots from my old drone time-stamped videos of the grounds. Nothing escaped the lens because I didn't trust memory to be evidence. I gathered what was left, then drove down to county offices, my demeanor controlled, almost clinical. I requested copies of every permit code complaint, demolition order, recorded meeting, and HOA notice on file for the address. Clerks watched me expecting fury, but I was polite, steady, thorough. That evening I sat down across from my attorney old friend, sharp as a tack, and spread out everything on his dining room table. Together we began plotting a straight timeline. Who had the authority, what was filed, what was missing, what was fabricated. No drama, just dates, signatures, postage marks. In that silence I could already tell there were holes in Karen's story, big enough to drive a bulldozer through. By the end of that week, Karen was positively glowing. She blasted out a mass email to every neighbor recapping the swift and necessary demolition as a win for safety and order. Phrases like courageous leadership and timely resolution hit all the right notes for her audience, framing the obliteration of my home as a public service. I watched it land in my inbox with clinical detachment and got to work. Reviewing the stack of documents item by item told a different story. The demolition permit Karen claimed to have expired by nearly 2 years. The notice of hearing, signed by 2 board members, one of whom had moved out months before. Meeting minutes that supposedly authorized action, dates didn't match the HOA's own archived records, a perfect forgery easy to spot if you knew where to look. When I traced the demolition company's paperwork, they'd never secured the environmental clearance the county required before breaking ground. The supposed health hazard cited in official notices was based on a single anonymous complaint. With a digital timestamp filed after the teardown had already begun, I didn't raise my voice. I organized files, compiled photos, dated every page. For Karen, paperwork was a shield. For me, it was a sword, precision weapons waiting for the right moment. The gears of real accountability finally started moving. Sorting through decades-old folders in the battered garage file cabinet, I found what every property owner secretly hopes for, but rarely expects: a loophole that isn't a loophole at all, just the result of someone long ago planning for trouble nobody saw coming. In the back, behind expired warranties and tax receipts, was a signed right-of-way easement stamped with the county seal. My grandfather's name, dated 1972, spelling out a clause: this property may not be subject to eminent domain seizure or forced alteration by municipal or private board, unless 2 direct descendants consent in writing. Simple. Ironclad. The kind of detail only someone with roots understands. I kept digging and found the home's special insurance rider, high-value restoration, full demolition coverage, and a stipulation for reimbursement at current market rates if destruction was unauthorized. Farther down, a folder marked Historic Status Application. It hadn't been finalized yet, but enough municipal correspondence existed to show it was active with the city's Historical Commission, putting another buffer between my home and HOA whims. A corporate land trust set up quietly by my father years before titled part of the lot separately from the structure. Karen and her board had no authority over it. All her threats, all her claims, they were built on sand, and I just found the tide. By the time most neighbors had deleted Karen's self-congratulatory emails, I had something far more tangible ready to deliver. My attorney drafted a complaint so thorough it read like an autopsy, every misstep, every forged signature, every shattered legal boundary lined up in black and white. We filed suit for unlawful demolition, breach of contract, destruction of historic property libel, for Karen's public misstatements and punitive damages, proportionate to the market value lost and the trust violated. Word spread quickly once the court summons landed at the HOA office. Local news anchors appeared on the sidewalk, camera crews capturing every nervous neighbor who dared to watch. The courtroom quickly filled: city officials, a handful of neighbors, even HOA members who suddenly remembered they'd always had concerns. No one smiled now. Karen arrived with her attorney, that same air of invincibility she wore when my house hit the dust. But for the first time she looked over at my table stacked with fact binders, documents tabbed and color-coded, and hesitated. This wasn't going to vanish with a nod, a signature, or a backroom vote. This time the story wasn't hers to script. The real hearing was just beginning. Courtrooms have their own gravity. The door shuts, conversations die off, and everyone waits for the other shoe to drop. Karen entered with her head high, arms folded, waiting for formality to stamp away my complaint. Her lawyer made the expected noises, procedures, followed community welfare, urgent necessity. I listened, not once raising my voice, simply waiting until the judge called my witness. and then methodically my attorney began unfolding the evidence. Deed records displaying the easement clause. Digital timestamps proving demolition commenced before the required hearing. Written statements from the Historical Commission confirming restoration status in process. Environmental engineers testifying the so-called health hazard was fabricated photos of my supposedly condemned foundation months before, in near-perfect condition. But what quieted everyone was the trail of signatures easily proven forged, and the trust documents showing the HOA had no legal standing on half the property. Karen's face didn't change at first. Then the judge began to question her. Why ignore valid insurance? Why schedule hearings when I was documented out of state? Why override municipal codes? He sat silent reading. 5 minutes dragged as Karen's confidence broke. His order came with no ambiguity. The HOA would rebuild the home to original standards, restore all historic features, and pay $10 million in punitive and compensatory damages. In that silence, power changed hands completely. A week later, the HOA called a special meeting in the clubhouse. Folding chairs set up in careful rows, neighbors pressed in on all sides, some curious, others embarrassed, but all eager to see how this would play out. I sat quietly near the back, hands folded, letting the room settle into its uneasy hush. The chairman read the judge's order aloud, sentence by sentence. Eyes darted to Karen, who stood by the podium, white-knuckled and silent. When her turn finally came, there was no rhetoric left, only a stilted apology she could barely get through. Her contract was voided on the spot board position, revoked reputation, reduced to something whispered about not admired. As she left, people avoided her gaze for the first time I could remember. In the doorway, a neighbor who'd stayed silent through it, all nodded at me, not quite a thank you, but close. The room was different now, tense, but with an undercurrent of relief and respect. Everyone realized in that moment what quiet persistence and thorough preparation could accomplish. In their own way, they took note. Arrogance isn't strength. Calm competence always outlasts bluster. With the ruling behind me, I watched as local craftsmen arrived, faces I recognized from past neighborhood projects, hands steady and voices unhurried. I gave them the original blueprints but quietly added updates my father would have appreciated. Better insulation, storm windows, a reinforced porch. The house rose from the debris in layers, new foundation poured, where family stories had once been told, the same oak standing sentinel by the drive. I never grandstanded or gloated. Satisfaction came from watching the community slowly return to something steady. A few neighbors stopped by shyly asking for advice on their own paperwork, and property boundaries hushed conversations over coffee at my workbench. I listened, shared what I knew, made copies of forms they might need someday. My goal wasn't revenge, but restoration in every sense. What was rebuilt wasn't just the house, but the truth about ownership and the importance of steady resolve. My family's legacy regained its footing and word spread. When you move quietly, backed by facts and preparation, even the most arrogant authority can't stand in your way for long. The victory in the end spoke for itself. When the last nail was set and the new key turned in the lock, I started walking the perimeter again. At sunset, the land looked much as it always had, but I saw it differently now. The corners of the property felt anchored. The legal papers, freshly stamped and notarized, went back into my safe, every page a shield against the next opportunist. With a mug of coffee and the scent of new lumber mixing with the old oak, I had time to reflect. Owning land isn't just about the dirt beneath your boots or the name on a mailbox. It's about knowing the rules better than those who enforce them, always keeping documentation a step ahead, and never trading calculation for conflict. As for Karen, her story faded as quickly as her influence. The community had learned to value quiet competence over noisy authority. I know justice doesn't always look this clear or feel this final, and if you think this was the end of my HOA battles, you'd be mistaken. Sometimes the battle over ownership is just the beginning. But that's a story for another evening.